Everyone to the final session of Baking with the Bible and Bread in the Bible. This is a little different than the other two sessions. Today we're going to have Tim Smith, who's the director of music here at St. Mike and All Angels, do a presentation on wheat. And we've baked with wheat, but we didn't really understand the different types of wheat and how that all works. So Tim.
All right, you get to see me in a different way than most people see me, and I'm a little out of my element. Usually I have a piece of furniture to hide behind and don't have to talk. So you get to see me in a new role today. Grass is a great green blanket of green over the earth and is the foundation of the food chain for most mammals. There are about 4,700 species of grasses, and none are known to be poisonous. In the first chapter of Genesis, then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. Interestingly, the animals that are specified in the Old Testament as being clean are all grass-eating mammals. That is, they have multiple chambered stomachs. The animals specified in the Old Testament are as being clean for consumption are all animals who subsist on grass. They have chambered stomachs that bring back the grass, and it can go be digested other ways. Wheatgrass in and of itself is the first visible evidence of a sprouted wheat seed. Reputedly, it has 103 vital vitamins, nutrients, phytochemicals that your body needs. And interestingly enough, your body needs 103 different compounds. So wheatgrass does it all. It's not just for hippies anymore. And so, I mean, you know, you go to a Whole Foods store or something like that, and you'll see a little plot of wheatgrass, and they'll harvest a little bit of it and put it in a blender. And I used to just roll my eyes, just thinking, "Oh, really?" But there's something to it, which is kind of interesting. After it germinates and grows, it puts on stalks, and then it heads out. And these are wheat heads, which I know you all have seen. This is looks like a truckload full of wheat. And the seed of wheatgrass is the wheatberry or kernel in our and it's our primary use of wheat. Wheat is an amazing food to store for emergency situations. Both wheat and honey can be stored indefinitely. There are reports of both being edible after 1,000 years or more. Viable wheat grains have been found in ancient tombs. As long as it's kept dry, you're good. There are over 30,000 varieties of wheat, and many of them are direct descendants of einkorn, E-I-N-K-O-R-N. Einkorn, what is one of the first cultivated strains of wheat, mainly because the seeds were large enough to be worth all the trouble. Spelt was a similar early strain, and then came a more complex strain called Ember Wheat or Farro in Italy. These wheat strains dominated the field throughout the ancient Middle East for about 4,000 years, and eventually a cultivated durum wheat emerged from the Emmer family, and it's believed to be around 1000 BC. I have some samples of wheat. If you would take just a few grains and put them in your hand, we'll talk about some various things. This is farro wheat, which is an ancient grain. farro is the Italian word for ember wheat. So it's an ancient grain. It differs from modern wheat in that it only has 28 chromosomes instead of 36. But it's the only whole grain ground that I could find in Fort Myers, so it looks like wheat, so we'll go with it. Over the centuries, farming, milling, and baking processes involved uses for wheat, which increased the skills required to meet the needs and be more specific. The needs became more specific. Growers, for instance, observed that wheat could be planted during two distinct seasons, autumn and spring. Spring wheat is planted after the snow has melted, and it grows straight through the summer and is ready for harvest in late summer or early autumn. In contrast, winter wheat is planted in autumn. The seeds germinate, sprout, and grow a few inches before the frost hits. And then when cold weather sets in, the plants go dormant. In the spring, winter wheat comes back to life and is ready for harvest in the late spring and early summer. Autumn planting doesn't work where winters are brutally cold, but where it does work, the wheat takes on very different characteristics than those of the same seeds planted in the spring. And we'll talk about the varieties of wheat in a little more depth soon. This is a cross-section of wheat. The one on the right is more specific. It has layers and all kinds of information that really is more than we need to know for our purposes today. The one on the left shows the bran, which covers the outer part of the wheat. The endosperm contains starch and protein. And the germ has a little embryo of a new plant. And if you will look at one of the grains that you have, at the bottom of it, you can see a little white part that is the germ. So if you were to put these in water and they sprouted, that's what would go first. So that's what they look like when they sprout. Now, the thing is, the bran layer has fiber, vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients. The germ has essential fatty acids, vitamin E, B vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients. The endosperm has carbohydrate and some protein, but no significant nutrients. And that's generally what we eat, is white flour. How do they separate all this? When this is ground, originally they had a graded set of screens or sieves that the biggest screen would let certain things through, and then it would get down to the finest screens, or I think it started with finest screen. And that was pretty much just endosperm, starch and protein. Then the bigger pieces would be down the line. A Frenchman invented a technique where he would blow air through it at certain velocities and blow out bran or the germ, leaving just the starch. And I'm sure there are other ways that people do it nowadays as well. Bran, as we said, it's a primary source of fiber, and fiber in and of itself is a carbohydrate, or the bran is a carbohydrate. But not all carbohydrates are created equally, and this one metabolizes slower than plain starch. Wheat bran is about 15% of the wheat kernel. It has half as many calories as the starch part of the wheat. The endosperm, I read a definition of starch, which you think you know what a starch is and what it is, but I'd never seen a definition, but it's a polysaccharide of glucose rings. And you just think, oh, it's just a bunch of sugar chains that have been put together. But the starch has two important functions. If you're making bread, it is important for texture. And how it affects texture is in two ways. The starch chains that are in the endosperm, the carbohydrate part, when it is heated, some of these polysaccharides start to break down. They will explode, and they will bind with water and hold water in. That's why bread cooked properly isn't really dry. Flavor comes from this part because there are sugars in it, and when the sugar chains break down, they do release some flavors. And the only part of the sugar that's exposed to high enough heat to make it caramelize is the outer shell of the bread, so you get crust. Then the proteins. One thing that distinguishes wheat from other grains, such as rye, barley, corn, and oats, is the amount and quality of proteins, which can combine with agitation to form gluten. You think, well, wheat is just gluten. Well, it's not. There are 4 proteins in the endosperm that, when agitated, they become stringy and sticky. When you knead bread, you know it changes. Those are really different proteins that are binding together to create a new protein. White flour is from the endosperm, which is about 75% of the kernel. The rest of this endosperm is protein, and we'll get into that significantly later. The germ is the nucleus of the seed, and it's comparable to the yolk of an egg. Wheat germ is particularly high in vitamin E, folic acid, and folate. It contains fatty acids, lipids, basically the building blocks of fats. The fatty acids and other oils in the germ put whole grain flours at risk of rancidity. If you buy some whole grain flour at the store, it doesn't have nearly the shelf life as white flour, and some people will put it in the refrigerator or the freezer just to extend its life, and it's because that's where the oil is. You know, the baby plant needs that. Now, there's 2 classifications of commercial wheat, hard wheat and soft wheat. And basically, the higher the protein content, the harder the wheat. And I saw a few of you do what I did as a kid when we would harvest wheat, and I would be stuck driving the truck. I would put it in my mouth and see how hard it was. This is pretty hard. I don't know if you've ever had any other wheat that's softer than this, but it doesn't really hurt your teeth to bite through. That has to do with protein content. And as we've talked about before, there's winter wheat, spring wheat, red wheat, white wheat, and durum wheat. As we said earlier, the winter wheat is planted in the fall, grown over the winter, produces a crop harvested in the spring or summer. Planting is usually in September or October, harvested in July or August the following year. 80% of the wheat grown worldwide is winter wheat. And there are practical reasons for this as well. If you are a farmer farming other crops like corn and soybeans. If your wheat is already planted, you don't have to worry about it. It's already done. So it saves you time, and it's planted at a time when you have time. Spring wheat varieties are planted in the spring. They mature in about 100 days. Characteristics of the wheat. Winter wheat is hardier than spring wheat, obviously, because it can survive a winter. It needs cold nights and warm days to germinate and thrive. Has a longer growing season, of course, usually around 10 months. It won't even flower until it experiences cold weather. Has a high protein content. Color often is lighter, but it depends on the variety. And this is the kind of wheat that we would use for breads and pasta. Some pasta, other pastas you would use durum wheat for. This is, when you plant wheat in the fall, it comes up just like a grass would in your yard. And then frost comes and it looks just like that, and you think, it's going to die like the grass in my yard. Well, in a sense it does, but it really goes dormant, because when the snow melts and the temperature gets to be a certain temperature in the spring, it's happy as a clam. It's back to life. Spring wheat is a warm season crop. It's not as hardy as a winter wheat, but it's heat resistant and drought resistant, which is important in some regions. Takes shorter growing time, usually around 100 days, lower in protein, lighter, good for cakes and pastries. And there are varieties of wheat. This particular variety, which is a spring wheat, doesn't really have the little needles coming out of each kernel like some wheat does. And then beyond this, there are varieties. There's about 30,000 varieties of wheat, depending on where you live, what characteristics you need. These have been crossbred. So in a way, they're genetically modified, but they're done with natural selection and not an invasive process like sometimes happens nowadays. For instance, Everest is a popular variety planted in central Kansas. TAM 114 is a little better suited for the Texas Panhandle. They're both hard red winter wheats, but they're better suited to different geographical conditions, and that would be temperature, moisture, soil composition. You pretty much have to know what your region will grow. And this is what farmers, I don't know if you've ever driven through a rural area and you'll see this little rundown coffee shop that is just lined with pickup trucks. This is what farmers discuss. And usually write all this stuff down on a paper napkin. That's how my grandfather did it. So.
Cool.
Yeah, hard red winter wheat is mostly grown in plain states and northern states and Canada. This variety is moderately high in protein, 10.5%, and used as an all-purpose flour, bread flour, and 40% of all wheat grown in the United States is hard red winter wheat. And as I was raiding the refrigerator, I found some props that were left from a prior session. And this is not Wondra or gold medal, which is just kind of a blend of everything. And the blends are carefully selected to do just a myriad of things. And years ago, I thought, oh, flour is flour. But I've had a few unfortunate culinary experiences realizing that flour is not flour. And I'll talk about that a little more. This King Arthur flour is organic, and I'll tell you kind of what that's all about. It tells you what the protein content is. It says it's 11.7. It even goes so far as to say that it is 100% U.S. hard red wheat grown on American farms. And it tells you what it's for. It's a relatively, you can pass this this on down. I don't know about you, but I am just a chronic label reader. You know, when I would take my kids to the store, they said, "Dad, why does it take 2 hours to get a handful of things?" I thought, well, there's stuff to know. Hard red spring wheat is mostly grown in the northern states and Canada, and it's one of the hardest wheats. Highest in protein content, about 13.5%. About a quarter of the wheat grown in the United States is hard spring wheat. I don't know if this is spring or winter wheat, but the protein content is such that I would think it would be spring wheat. Hard white wheat is sweeter and lighter in color than red wheat, with a protein profile similar to hard winter red wheat. Only about 1% of wheat grown in the U.S. is of this type, but it's increasing in popularity. In researching whole grain bread recipes, there are some recipes that call for whole grain white wheat. And when I first read that, I thought that is a contradiction in terms. You know, because whole wheat isn't white. Well, it can be. And it can still be 100% whole grain. Soft red winter wheat generally is from the eastern part of the United States. Ohio is particularly good for it. It's low in protein. It's really good for pastries, cakes, and crackers. Really fluffy. Soft white wheat is generally grown in a few eastern states in the Pacific Northwest and California. It's similar to soft red winter wheat, but with a sweeter flavor. 7% of wheat grown in the U.S. is of this variety. And this is where I learned a kind of a bad lesson. Is I thought I was being virtuous. I was going to order some wheat. I was going to mill it myself. A friend in Orlando gave me her grain miller. She was cleaning out a shed. She had all the culinary toys, and she knew I liked that kind of stuff. So I was a beneficiary of some. Well, I ground some soft white wheat, and this bread maker, it grinds it to just a fine powder, and it sounds like a jet engine going off. It's really, you wouldn't do it in an apartment. You would do it when you had all your windows closed so nobody could hear it. Well, I baked a whole grain recipe, a bread recipe with this, and it was basically library paste. It said in the recipe that you might, with certain kinds of wheats that you mill yourself, you might need to add a teaspoon or 2 more at a time to make it come out right. Well, we weren't talking teaspoons, we were talking cups, you know, and I just thought, no, we're done, we're not doing that again. So,
one and done.
yeah, so I'm not using that variety anymore. Durham wheat is the hardest of the wheats. It's usually northern states, Montana, North Dakota, although some in northern Arizona, California, and South Dakota. It's the highest protein. It's basically used in pasta and couscous. And as you know, when you have pasta that's not been rehydrated, it's hard. It's really hard. This is how wheat is harvested. I grew up with this kind of thing, but I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is, you know, we call that a combine. The head on there is for soybeans or wheat. For corn, it has a different head. It has a reel on it that circulates and gathers wheat in. There's a sickle bar across there that cuts the stalk off, and this auger takes it all to the center, and it goes into the machine through a series of beaters that beat the kernel out of the chaff. It goes through a series of screens where the chaff falls through. It has some straw walkers that'll walk the straw back, and it sends it out the back here. And the grain gets augered up into the hopper, and then nowadays, most farmers have grain carts. Back when I was in college and high school, it was a truck, and we would just truck it to the elevator, but farms are bigger now, and they produce more grain, and that's just not very efficient. So this grain cart will either take it to an 18-wheeler grain truck or a grain bin, and I'll talk more about that a little later. One thing that's a little disturbing about this photo is the amount of weeds that were in this field. And I don't know if this is the edge of the field or what the field looked like before it was harvested. And why that is alarming is there's what a wheat field looks like.
Wow.
And it can happen. What's alarming about this is that is a problem for a combine to separate all that out. So farmers, and less so, are doing this, thankfully. They will, after the wheat really, the golden part, it's dead. I mean, it's basically done its life cycle. All we have is the seed left to harvest. So the green stuff, they'll spray it with Roundup just to get rid of it. And that does the trick, but
Now we're eating.
it's on the grain, and the grain is harvested before it has a chance to break down. And I don't know if you have read any articles, but I have, where the chemical in Roundup it appears in cereal, in commercial products, and it's just like, no, we can't do that anymore. Yeah. But you do have to control the weeds, because if you have wheat seed in your wheat, they will dock you for it. I mean, they will take so many cents a bushel off of that. Plus it just looks bad. And
How does it taste?
it's usually filtered out by the time you get it, so no. Yeah. So when we talk about organic wheat, I don't think wheat has been genetically modified just yet. But I think what that refers to, it hasn't been sprayed with any chemicals to take care of the weeds after the plant has run its life cycle. Genetically modified crops in and of themselves aren't a bad thing. They can change characteristics, and a lot of times farmers will say, we're doing this because we need to feed the world and this, that, and the other, and partly that's true. But the other part of why that plant has been genetically modified is so Roundup won't kill it. Corn, for instance, will advertise, if you go through the Midwest and you'll see a Pioneer seed corn commercial, they'll tout its benefits, and one of them is it's Roundup ready. And you just think, no. So,
Roundup ready means
it's genetically modified so you can spray Roundup on it, kill all the weeds, and it won't kill the corn.
I see,
It'll kill us.
but it'll
Yeah.
kill us.
Yeah.
Back in the day, well, Monsanto, pays. I hope nobody worked for Monsanto in here.
I live right behind the plant, and I used to make pallets and send them to the agriculture department in Iowa, or some farmer up in, so that they could put the product on the pallets. So I know Monsanto.
Yeah, well, they have engineered a crop that will stand up to their product. So you're pretty much dependent on them. So in a sense, they control our food source. I'm very close to getting on a soapbox, and I'll refrain from it. This plot is a family plot. This particular, there's a road that goes through there, and this is 3.8 acres. I know that because when I was in grade school, my grandfather gave me that plot. And we planted wheat, and it went into my college fund. And of course he did all the work, but I had to keep the books, I had to manage it, I had to keep records and everything like that. I show you this because whereas my mother and I would go round and round about Roundup, these are conservation acres, and they call it a CRP program. I don't remember what those stand for. But this is Native American prairie grass. And I can't tell you the grasses that are in there. And you sign up for this program in 15-year intervals. It's been through one cycle already. She signed it up for another 15-year cycle about a year ago before she died. And the reason why you do that is for two things. They do pay you fairly generously to do this. You have to buy the seed, and she said it was pretty expensive. But it has a root system that goes down 30 feet, which helps with erosion, and it helps with water control and soil regeneration, which is kind of a big deal right now. The other thing is, if it's a native grass, it chokes out invasive weeds. And you notice in this field, the only thing you see is grass. You don't see any weeds. If one wanted to do organic farming, these particular plots are ready. I mean, they could do that. I was asking my mother about this, about the program, and she said, well, those are 15-year commitments, you can't touch that, and she went into general apoplexy about it and told me basically nothing. And from my sister, even my questions made her say, he either wants to change everything, or he says, or I'm not doing a good job. So I thought, okay, no more questions. I'll just go back to work. And here I am. So, ag prices are through the roof these days. Wheat is, I know it's hard to read. It says May 22, Chicago soft red wheat. May would be kind of the end of last year's growing season, so it's old grain, and there isn't much supply coming in at the end of May. I mean, there's none, so I mean, it's over $10, it's $10 a bushel. Wheat historically has been around $5 a bushel. And this has changed within the last 2 months. It was going up before, but we've got a major supplier of wheat that's offline right now, Ukraine, and Russia. You know, we're not dealing with them anymore. That's a major supplier of global wheat supplies. The other thing that can affect prices is the weather forecast locally. It could be the weather forecast in Brazil and Argentina, because they're in summer right now, and how their crop matures, and if it comes in under expectation, our prices go up. If it's a bumper crop, our prices go down. So it's a very worldwide complex web of circumstances. Historically, wheat prices, when I was in grade school, $2 in 1960 wasn't bad. And then it went down, and I remember about the time I went into high school, my parents and grandparents stopped planting wheat, and I think this is why. Corn and soybeans were just more profitable. But if you look over here, it's close to $12 a bushel today. So I suspect that there's going to be some more wheat planted this year than last year. A few other things. Why would you want to use 100% organic whole wheat? Well, my interest in it has to do with the genetic code of my family. I favored my father and my grandmother, who were both serious diabetics. I share their coloring. I look like my father, I'm told. I haven't been diagnosed with that, but it's only a matter of time. It's time to start being interested in how one needs to eat. If the Bran is there and the Germ is there, the glycemic index, that is how your blood metabolizes sugar, is lower. There's fiber in it, there's nutrients, there's no chemicals, and you can't beat the flavor. There is a concern, a growing concern these days about gluten intolerance. You know, we even have gluten-free wafers for community here for those who need it. And nobody knows why this is happening for sure. I had never heard of gluten intolerance until about a decade ago. When I was a kid, that was unheard of. Like, what? Yeah. They suspect that it is a disruption in gut flora and bacteria that have been killed, and they have been killed or modified in a certain way by several reasons. One time they used to use iodine in flour as a stabilizer and a texture control. Well, iodine is something your body needs. Salt is iodized. But sometimes they use biotin, which is toxic. And I think one of these said, that it didn't use any biotin. Well, I can't find it now, but it said, it did say that they didn't use biotin in it. The other culprit for changing gut flora and bacteria is, you want to guess what it might be? Roundup.
Roundup. Oh, goodness.
Yeah. Gluten is not totally evil. It is important for a good bread rise, of course. That's why we use wheat flour instead of oat flour. Have you ever tried to make bread with oat flour? It's pretty sad. It just doesn't do much. Gluten can be extracted commercially. It can be extracted in your kitchen. And I had a little science experiment yesterday because I read about this. And fortunately, Sue had left some white flour, so I thought, okay, I can really try this. What happens if you mix water and flour and stir it, it gets stringy. And gluten is from the Latin root for glue. It's sticky when you knead bread. if you develop a gluten, which as we talked about earlier, is several proteins that have merged, you can put it under a running faucet or through cheesecloth and wash the starch out of it, and you have nothing left but protein. And they will sell that commercially. You can buy, they call it vital wheat gluten. The other name for it is seitan, which basically is wheat-based tofu. And that's what they make grain burgers out of that vegetarians would eat. It's just gluten. It is a form of protein. I mean, it's not intrinsically evil. Back to this list, they'll talk about these are major grain ports: Chicago, Kansas City, Minneapolis. Say you've got spring wheat, for September 22nd, it's $10 and almost 50 cents. If you deliver it in December of 22, it's worth $10.57. How do you keep wheat that long, or soybeans that long, or grain that long? That's why people have grain bins. They store it, and sometimes the price differential is so much that it will pay for the cost of the structure over X number of years. This year, I think you could pay them off in a year. Also, wheat comes out of the field at about 16 or 17% humidity. Saleable wheat needs to be at 14%. Why is that important? Because wheat is, when you take wheat to sell it, they will talk about how many bushels you had. Well, if that is 3% water, that's not 3% grain. It'll affect how much wheat is in a bushel. Plus, it won't store as well. It will mold. If it's too wet, it'll sprout. Say, well, why don't you just leave it in the field until it's 14%? Well, in an ideal world, you would. But that's where weather forecasts come in. You just think, okay, this wheat is ready now. It's going to start raining in 3 days and rain for a week. By that time, it's going to sprout in the head. You have to get it out of the field now and put it in the bin. Well, it's at 16% or 17% or 19%, but you really have to get rid of it. So you put it in one of these. And this is what you saw. This grain cart is what you saw in the field earlier. The combine was putting grain in that. They take that to this wagon, which is a gravity-fed wagon. It goes into this auger and up into the grain bins for storage. Well, if it's too wet, that's going to be a problem because it's going to mold and ruin a lot of grain. What they do is these little augers have electric motors up there. They spin constantly. They bring grain up from the floor, and over time, this goes all the way around the circumference, and these things start moving in. So basically, the whole grain bin is turned over. And then you have this thing, which is a giant fan, and this is a giant burner, like your heater. If you had gas heat, it is like that, and it blows at a very high rate of speed into the grain bin. And the floor of a grain bin is perforated, so all that air can get through there. So basically, it's a giant clothes dryer. And then when you get it to whatever percentage which is safe to store and pleasing to a grain dealer, you're good to go. You seal it up and forget it until it's time to sell. And then when it's time to sell, you see these little holes in the floor. That's where the grain is emptied. It goes down, it's collected, an auger takes it out, goes up another auger, and goes into a grain truck. So, and then off to the river or to a rail terminal or something like that. Something that I think is really interesting is a new development, is a perennial wheat, Kerns. It's been in development for 20 years or so in Kansas and Minnesota. It is, I suppose, genetically modified in a sense, but no more so than making a hybrid seed of any variety. And how you do that is you plant two varieties next to each other. I had colleagues in high school, I've fortunately never had to do this, but they would be seed corn farms. You would plant several rows of corn of one strain and several rows of corn of another strain. And when they tassel, that is the flower that comes out, you go through on this mechanized platform and manually pull out all the tassels. I mean, you're in this pollen and your hands are just, it's child abuse, but we all, I had other jobs, I didn't do that one, but they were equally bad. So that's how Kerns, it's been crossbred with several other wheats, and that's gone on for centuries. I mean, that's not a new thing, and that's not an evil thing. It looks more like a grass, as you see, than traditional wheat, and the shape of the grain looks more like wild rice. It's thinner and longer, and it's a perennial, meaning that you don't have to plant it every year, and over winter you've got a ground cover, and the root system is about 10 feet deep. So there are savings on every level, and with root systems like that and a ground cover, it can store carbon, which is a growing concern. There is a movement of doing ground cover over winters. The people of my great-grandfather's generation would never leave a field uncovered over the winter. We do now. And when I was in Illinois last, was horrified that ours is just exposed. No, it's not so good. Here's a Kerns field. It looks like a grass field. Obviously, well, it's all season because it's a perennial. That's in Minnesota, which often looks like that. As you can see, this Kerns that has been grown in a pot has quite the root system. And I found a really cool video this Minnesota farm boy explains it far better than I could. And I'll share.
I grew up here in Minnesota, and I think that where the heart of the Midwest really shines is in prairie. The wide-rooted grasslands that are the reason we have such rich, productive soil here. Soil is really the largest carbon bank that we have. Being able to protect our soil is such a big opportunity in fighting climate change. My name is Christopher Abbott, and I'm the founder of Perennial Pantry. Perennial Pantry is a dedicated Kerns processor and food brand. Grains primarily have to be planted every year and contribute to the breakdown of soils. As the first perennial grain, Kerns comes back year after year. It holds on to that soil and replicates nature in many ways. At Perennial Pantry, we're taking Kerns straight from a farmer and turning it into a variety of different food products. Kerns has been developed by breeders at the Land Institute over the last 2 decades.
At the Land Institute, we are fostering the development of a new kind of agriculture based on perennial crops. Kerns has large, extensive, deep roots. It's one of the best ways to build soil quality and capture carbon.
As we face a climate crisis that is here, the cheapest, most scalable solutions are natural-based climate solutions like these roots in the ground,
breeding Kerns over the past nearly 20 years now. The development of genome sequencing was revolutionary. Just by looking at DNA, we can predict how the plant's going to perform, even though it's only a couple weeks old. We breed for grain yield primarily. We hope that we can bring our yields of Kerns in the ballpark of crops like wheat.
It's a big new idea, Kerns, and that means there's a lot of uncertainty, but that really places it in this exciting space for entrepreneurship to solve problems. In our test kitchen, we're developing recipes and doing a lot of that applied research. I can feel terribly overwhelmed about climate change, but I think what's most exciting about Kerns right now is the possibility. Over time, Kerns and this whole host of other crops that are coming behind it can rebuild a new system and reimagine a way of bringing food to our plates.
I think that is a really intriguing, positive, exciting development. And my son's mother-in-law has an organic, sustainable farm in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. And I was asking her about if she had heard about this or knew anything about it. She said, oh, we're a test plot for that. So we need to talk. That is corn. That is our farmer. Anyway, there is a luscious picture of whole grain bread.
Yeah.
And I have some resources that I want to share with you. In early COVID, everybody had was on the bread making craze, so much so that you couldn't buy flour in the store. And I thought, I'm going to try sourdough bread. And I made a starter that took a week. And I made this bread and it was library paste. It was really bad. And I read since that many people's first foray into sourdough bread is a similar result. So I didn't feel quite so stupid. I thought, okay, but also, usually when I have an incident like that, I go into overcompensate mode. I say, I'm going to master this. So I ordered this book. And it is a gorgeous book, and I commend it to you. It's all whole grains. Not all of them are sourdough. They do use yeasts. But the prefatory material in here is kind of what I told you today, only it goes far deeper into food chemistry and more than you or I would need to know, unless you're interested in that kind of thing. There are books about this. There's a sequel to it as well now. It's called What Einstein Told His Cook. I don't know if you've ever seen that book, but it talks about when you apply, for instance, if you apply heat to an egg, it changes. We all know that. Why? You know, there are a whole series of complicated things, and I kind of geek out on that kind of stuff. But anyway, this book is kind of fun. This book, Anne-Marie Boucher shared with me, Domestication of Plants in the Old World. And it gives the history of a lot of those ancient wheats. In more detail, it's by Oxford University Press, so it's probably in more detail than we ever need to know, but it's very scholarly. And I was looking for a recipe that was 100% whole grain wheat bread that wasn't a brick. And I've tried many and had ho-hum results. Well, this says the very best whole wheat bread, and usually when I see a title like that, well, we'll see. But it has 5 stars. Well, I tried this bread with low expectations, and it actually, for the rising process, you take a cold oven, you heat it at 350 degrees for 60 seconds and turn it off. and put the bread in. Thought, well, all right, how bad can it be? 45 minutes later, the bread had risen so much that it rose into the rack above it. I thought, oh. And it is kind of my go-to bread recipe. It's pretty easy. It calls for vital wheat gluten, which is the protein, so it increases the gluten content, which actually gives it a little more elasticity, so it can rise it better. It will work without it, but in the footnotes, she says, other types of flour, regular whole wheat flour, all-purpose white flour, freshly milled wheat flour, may be substituted, et cetera, et cetera. Also, if you use an alternative flour, particularly fresh milled flour, that would be me, which can be less dense, you may need to slightly adjust the amount of flour added to the end of the recipe. For example, if the dough seems extra sticky and doesn't start pulling away from the bowl, you can work in additional flour 1 teaspoon at a time. This is the one that I was pouring a cup at a time until the texture seems right. I wish I'd known that before I had done that, but anyway, this makes 2 loaves, and I've only had 1 failure, and that's because I used the wrong wheat. So anyway, for those who care to have one, it's kind of fun to make.
Question,
Yes.
if I may ask, so you said 350, I'm stuck on this, 350 oven, preheat the oven totally and then put it in and turn off? No.
You put it at 350 for 1 minute and turn it off.
Oh my goodness.
So you've basically got a bread proofing box.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's what it is. So.
Wow.
Yeah, which is
Great
unique.
British
I've never
baking.
heard of a recipe that.
Yeah.
And where did you get that glucose something or
The
other?
vital wheat.
Yeah, vital, thank you.
I got it at Harvest Market, which is kind of Midwest's answer to Whole Foods. It was in the bulk aisle. But you can also buy several kinds of wheat. You can buy hard white, you can buy soft red. I was kind of hoping that Whole Foods here would have that, which they didn't, so.
Of course.
And of course, if all else fails, there's always Amazon,
I was gonna say that.
when it comes to you, so.
True, sure.
So that's
Thanks.
that's what I know about wheat. So I'm still learning.
That's
so.
great. Thank you so much.